In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. You know, those opening words of the first part of the Bible are the only words that give the answer to the real questions in life. Where did we come from? And why are we here? And the following 3 chapters answers the other 2 critical questions in life. What was it that went wrong at the very start? And how do we fix it? You know, we are about to start a journey into the history where the only person that was there tells us through the pen of one of his representatives. And that representative was the Jewish hero Moses. Genesis is God's brief to Moses. There is no explanation that fits the facts and explains the facts of creation and our origin like the record given to us in the opening chapters of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, when secular man looks at his origin, he creates a mental box that he cannot go beyond. Everything must fit into his naturalistic, materialistic order governed by natural selection. Then over a period of time, simple life forms become complex life forms. And after enough time, they evolve into human beings. So it's from slime to complexity. But this is a fabricated myth and has been the bedrock of scientific teaching in our educational curriculum for decades. And sadly, our culture has reaped the consequences. Take any secondary school textbook on science or biology, and you will find evolution is the only hypothesis presented. It starts with the simple question, where did life come from? And you'll have 5 typical answers that are given to back up this hypothesis that it evolved. Question number 1 is, where did life start? It started in a pond of slime. And to prove that hypothesis, Stanley Miller's experiment in 1953 is often used. Stanley was a graduate student of the University of Chicago, and Stanley believed that the gases that would have been present in the atmosphere at the beginning of time were methane, hydrogen, and ammonia. By the way, no one answers the question, where did those gases come from and who made them? But that's an incidental in their thinking. In this experiment, Stanley Miller added these gases to water in a test tube and then created an electric charge that he believed would simulate lightning strikes. And after a week, his experiment produced this black fluid in a test tube. Now, when examining the contents, they found amino acids, which we know to be the building blocks for life. So here we have the complex molecule produced by natural selection. That was their conclusion. So now here was the proof of the starting point for life. And therefore, we don't need God. So the second point that is often referred to is what we call Charles Darwin's tree of life. Now, Darwin has drawn a simple graph to show how, in his mind, species developed over time from the simple to the complex. And this change occurs through natural selection. So we start with our ancestors, or our ancient ancestors, at the bottom, and then they are developed upward into the limbs and the branches and the twigs as life evolved with increasing diversity and complexity. You know, the different breeds of dogs from the common ancestor is often given as proof of this. Because you look at the Great Dane, and then you can look at the Chihuahua, and you can see how they've changed coming from the same ancestors. And then their third question is there any factual science that would show species evolving over different ancestors, from different ancestors? And the man that is referred to here or is given as a proof is the German biologist Ernest Haeckel. He drew up what he called embryos or copies of embryos from a fish, a salamander, a tortoise, a chicken, a pig, a calf, a rabbit, and then a human being. And when you look at his drawings, all the embryos look similar. Therefore, he concluded that we have a common ancestor and that we've evolved over time from that same source. And within the human embryo, Hegel argues that you could see what looks like fish gills, or what looks like the tail of a tail of a monkey. And he says, therefore, those reflections or shadows on the embryo of a human show you where they've come from in the past. They're all linked. They all have a common ancestor. That was his conclusion. Now we face question 4. Are there any links that show the development of the transition from one species to another? And they say the answer is yes. And they refer to what is known as the ancient wing. It's about 150 million year old fossil, and it shows feathers, they believe, in the body, and also a wishbone, and it seems to have a tail like a lizard and claws on its wings. So they state, here's the proof that birds became lizards, or was it the other way around, lizards became birds? And then we have what they call the 5th proof. They begin to look at fossils. Now, fossils have been found all over the world. And these are skeletons either in full or partial that help show what they call the various links of development from species to species. Most of these are complete or partial skeletons that have been found. But the interesting thing is, when there are only 1 or 2 bones that are found in a skeleton, the artist seems to have the freedom to make out of that whatever he or she wants it to look like. And then you've got number 6. You've got the fact of DNA. Now, similarities between the DNA of chimpanzees and humans has often presented as being a fact to prove evolution. Back in 1975, when this was first presented, we lived with the message that 98% of chimpanzees and humans have the same DNA. When man removes God out of the equation, he only has evolution to fall back on. And this is because he chooses to live within the naturalistic, materialistic limitations. But more factual and scientifically supportive answers to creation is what we read in the opening words of Genesis, chapter 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And we need to remember that when a person is passionate about something, it's very easy to turn a blind eye to the information that challenges or even disproves their assumptions. Now, that is true also, let me say, on both sides of any argument. But let's look at those 5 stepping stones that supposedly support evolution. Remember, the first one was Stanley Miller's experiment? Well, true enough, he got what looked like amino acids, but what you aren't told is that there were no DNA or RNA within that amino acid. In other words, it wasn't a living thing and it had no capacity to reproduce itself. You see, only life can reproduce life, and God is the author of life. And then when you look at Darwin's tree of life, it requires species over time to become different species. However, creatures can only breed within their own species. The illustration is often given, however, of lions that can be crossed with tigers and creating what is known as a liger. But lions can breed with tigers because they are from the same species or from the cat family. That's what Genesis calls, they can breed according to their own kind. But then even within species, there are limitations that are governed by DNA. For example, ligars cannot breed with ligars. You see, Genesis tells us that creatures can only breed within their own kind or species, which is the modern word that is used. And all dogs can breed within a huge selection of breeds, but dogs cannot breed with other species. And as far as Ernest Haeckel's drawings are concerned, you can't conclude that similarities at the point of conception or early gestation justify the conclusion that all species came from the same source. You see, the end product denies that. The visual similarities that are there because they all have a spine and skulls and ribs and limbs that look similar at the start. It's also important to note that his drawings were discovered to be extremely inaccurate. And he said he was only trying to make them more accurate than the faulty specimens on which they were based. Well, that tells you a lot, doesn't it? He drew them to reflect his own bias. And then number 4, when you look at the fossils of the ancient wing, I believe you're looking at a species of a bird that has died out over time, like so many other species. You know, there are lots of species that have been lost over time and they no longer exist. For example, the woolly mammoth, or dinosaurs, or fossils that are known as the ancient wing. You can only say this is a missing link if you choose that option. You see, there is nothing that says that it is not just an extinct bird. And then when you look at fossils, the record should reveal the gradual evolutionary changes within the species. But they don't. There have been millions of fossils found, and nowhere have we found what we call the missing link. We've only found partial or complete skeletons that are recognizable with all other fossils found of that same species. No variables, no visible changes, only true to the type of skeleton that has been fossilized. And also when dinosaurs were found, there were also skeletons of mammals. And they were not supposed to be existing 65 million years ago when dinosaurs supposedly roamed the earth. You know, there's a great scientist, Dr. Carl Warner, who has written a book called Living Fossils. And I think his comments are very insightful. He says, it turns out that mammals are not all that rare in dinosaur rock layers. Dinosaur-age mammals have been found in Europe and Canada and China and Australia and the United States. And as far as the similarity of the DNA between chimpanzees and man, these early DNA figures were widely accepted and popularized by evolutionists. But this was long before even the human and the chimp genomes were actually created and announced in the year 2001 and 2005, respectively. With our modern understanding of genetics, we now know that 98% is simply not the case. Even with genes that are similar between chimps and humans, the similarity is closer to 80%. And if we consider the genes that chimps have that humans don't and vice versa, the similarity drops to 70% or even less. However, the 98% myth still persists. You know, that brings me back to the only answer to the origin of life, and it's presented in Genesis. So let's look at the record and accept it as it's stated. It fits with the reality of history and science and life. You start with 7 days, and the Hebrew word for day is Yom. You're probably familiar with the word Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, which is a 24-hour day period. So the first 3 days are the formation in creation, and the next 3 days, the creation is filled. And then on the 7th day, God rested. So day 1, you find that light and darkness was created. You know, people wondered how there could be light when the sun and the moon and the stars weren't created until day 4. But you know, God is light. And as it says in 1 John chapter 1 verse 5, God is light and in him is no darkness at all. So God does not need the sun to shine light into this world. In other words, God was setting up the model that he was going to fill on day 4, and his light was the prototype of what was to come. Then you have day 2, where the water in the sky is created. And there was water in the sky or the atmosphere, and this globe was covered with water. Then on day 3, we have the separation of the seawater from the land. And then God created vegetation on the land, the small plants and the fruit trees. And this is where we have the introduction to reproduction and procreation for the first time. Seeds that come from the fruit on the tree can reproduce. And this is where the DNA and the RNA starts as seeds reproduce each according to its own kind, as it's stated in verse 11. You know, the complexity behind reproduction is huge. And then on day 4, God created the sun, the moon, and the stars. Now it takes us back to the formation set up on day one, where God formed what he now fills, the heavens. Remember it said, and God created the heavens and the earth. Notice that all the heavenly lights were to provide something for this earth. Firstly, the heavenly lights were to be signs, and they were to mark seasons and days and years. The days come from the self-revolving of the earth, and then the years are ticked off when the earth rotates around the sun. But the seasons occur because the earth is on a 23-degree angle. If the slant was not exactly 23 degrees, we would not only lose our seasons, but life itself, because evaporation of the seawater would create continents of ice. And also, if the moon were closer to the earth, our tides would swamp our continents. So God created a finely tuned universe, and a reasonable mind would realize that this is so finely tuned, with so many parts depending on each other and requiring all of them to occur at the same time, that it couldn't happen by chance. You know, evolutionists acknowledge the complexity involved, but they conclude that it's here and it did happen and there is no other explanation. So accept that sometime luck can be very helpful. Believing that is a leap into the mystical world beyond reality. For these events to occur would require the greatest mind to plan it and infinite power to create it. And there is such a being, and we know him as God. But God also said that the heavens were meant to be a sign, and signs point to things. Look around and you will see signs everywhere in your cities. They're guiding you to places where you need to go. So what do the heavenly hosts point to? You know, it was Psalm 19, verse 1 that says, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the earth shows his handiwork." You know, God's signature is written everywhere within creation. We will never know the origins of creation unless we view what we see through the lens of God. Within the limitations of our naturalistic, materialistic framework, we will never find answers to the origin of our starry sky. People that are limited to the see, the touch, the hear, the taste, the smell world display an intellectual poverty that leaves them without answers. Bringing God into the equation changes everything. Questions like, if stars are 100 million light years from the earth, how can we see light from them, traveling at 300,000 kilometers a second? If we accept the Genesis young earth creation account, which is roughly around 10,000 years ago. Well, that's not a question for science. It's a question of how well do you know or don't know the God that created all of this? Have you ever considered his existence, his creative and resourceful powers? Isaiah poses the question God asks of mankind. "To whom will you compare me that I should be like him?" says the Holy One. "Lift up your eyes on high and see who created these. He who brings out their hosts by numbers, calling them by name, by the greatness of his might, and because he is strong in power, not one is missing." That's Isaiah 40 verse 26. You know, one day we will know some of the secrets of God, but in the meantime, don't put intellectual limitations on God, for he has none. Now we're at day 5. Here we see fish filling the ocean and the birds filling the skies. Now the formation of day 2 is being filled. And don't forget that the food for the birds has already been created as a result of day 3. God made fruit trees and vegetation. And now day 6. This is the day that filled the earth with living creatures and livestock and creeping things and beasts of the earth. And 5 times in 2 verses we see how God created sexual reproduction, where species could multiply according to their own kind. Within every species, there was the ability to reproduce with huge varieties within the species. You can see this when you look at cattle, for example. You look at dairy cattle and you've got what we know to be Friesians and Brown Swiss and Jerseys and Ayrshires, to just name a few. Or also another kind of cattle called the beef cattle. And we have in that, you've got Angus and Herefords and Brahmans and Simmentals and Limousins and a whole host of other breeds. But all of them are bovines, and all of them can breed within the species. Just like God said, great diversity, but only within their species. And you know, that's why Darwin's evolutionary theory is totally fabricated. In fact, it's a possibility. It was on the sixth day that God created all these species, and within those species they were able to reproduce according to their kinds and not go beyond that. They couldn't change from one species to another. Also, on the sixth day, we know that God created man. Now, man would be different from all the animals because he was made in the image of God. Now, that doesn't mean that man would look like God, because God is a spirit and he has no physical form. But it does mean that man would act like God. God's values and desires and goals would be man's values, desires and goals. And they were until they were destroyed by sin. We understand so much about what makes up the human body to now that it's incredible to discover how, as the Bible says, we're fearfully and wonderfully made. You realize God took dirt, the soil of the ground, and he fashioned a frame that had 200 bones in the human skeleton. And then he created a nervous system that has some 7 trillion nerves within the body. And organs like lungs and the heart and the brain, each formed with human cells. 10 trillion cells were molded to make up the human body. And each cell has within it just one word, which would contain the functional blueprint for every operation man would perform. This one word was made up of 5 billion letters. It's what we call our DNA, and it enables the body to function and to reproduce itself and to sustain itself. God breathed life into man, and this was the kind of life he created, and man became a living soul. It's interesting to notice that this life came as a result of God breathing into mankind his life, but also creating human blood. Because the Bible says your life is in the genetics that produces the blood. And his blood would circulate via a network of arteries and veins that, if you put them all together in one line, would measure 100,000 kilometers or 60,000 miles, whichever one you use. And Adam's blood would circulate through that human body every 32 seconds, taking oxygen that it picked up from the lungs to keep each cell alive, and energy that it picked up from the digestive system to grow and sustain each cell throughout the human body. Again, I say, it's no wonder that the Bible says we are fearfully and wonderfully made. God lives within the Father, Son, Holy Spirit relating to each other world. They have companionship. And so when God created man, he also created man that needed to have companionship. To start with, God brought all the animals for Adam to name, to see if there was any animal that was created that it could be a partner or a companion to him. And of course there was none. But think of it. How would you like the job of having to name all the species of animals that were created that day? That just gives you an insight into the genius of Adam, because he was created in the image of God, who in himself is an intellectual genius. Well, when there was no one found that was compatible with Adam in a real soul, heart-like way, you know what God did? He put Adam to sleep. And when he was asleep, he took out of his side a rib. And out of that rib, he fashioned a woman. You know, Adam liked what he saw when he woke up out of that sleep, and he called Eve, that woman, he called her a woman. And then God told them to multiply and to fill the earth and to subdue it. And they were given controlling authority over everything within their world. Dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and over everything that moved on the earth. This was their administrative responsibility. No small task, you'd have to agree, but they were up to it. Why? Because they were created in the image of God. That day ended with these words, "And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good." 6 days he created everything that exists. 3 days to form it, and 3 days to fill it in. Then on the 7th day, God rested. In Genesis chapter 2, verse 3, we read these words, "And God blessed the 7th day." God has used the word blessed, because we'd love to know what that means, twice already. The first was in chapter 1 and verse 22, where he refers to blessing the fish and the birds and telling them to multiply and be fruitful. And the second is in chapter 1, verse 28, where God is speaking to Adam and to Eve, and God blesses them and told them to be fruitful and multiply. But it's obvious that being fruitful and multiplying has some link to being blessed. And we enter into a rest, as it were, as God calls it, when those things take place. So what's he talking about when he says he wants to bless the 7th day and we're to rest, and resting seems to mean being fruitful and multiply? I think you need to go to the New Testament to find the answer for that. You find it in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 11, where Jesus says in verse 28, "Come to me, all who labour and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me," and underscore that word learn from me, "for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest." Rest for what? Rest for your souls. "For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." The rest that was born out of the 7th day was to be a rest for the soul. But it's a rest that's meant to be discovery, where you discover, because Jesus said, "Learn of me in your rest." It doesn't mean that you spend your day on a comfortable couch or a chair and relax the hours away. But you know, if you go back to a verse before what we read there in 11 and verse 27, you will see that Jesus tells us that no one knows the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son reveals him. Then Jesus invited them to come to him that they might have rest. It would bring a contentment to your life that would be so fulfilling. You would be at rest with yourself and with God and with the world. And it all comes from learning from Jesus. Take my yoke, learn from me. It produces rest, and rest is a blessing. And that rest is discovering, as Jesus reveals his Father, it's discovering who God is. And that was the one thing Philip wanted. Jesus showed us the Father, and that would be enough, he said in John chapter 14. In 6 days, God created the world and all that was in it. And it was paradise, a place where God and man walked together in partnership, and it was filled with joy and excitement. But something happened that destroyed everything.